Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Breakfast Club with Got That Funk. Thank you for joining me. I'd also like to say thank you to Brock Lawley for guest hosting yesterday, and obviously Agent of Doubt's been sitting in for Nathan Brendan Masters for the past few weeks. And I wanted to respond to both of their videos from earlier this week. To Brock's really quickly because he was responding to my video, which was actually an old one from the old Breakfast Club. About whether Brock asked a few questions. He was basically agreeing with me that nothing is taboo for comedy. I think everybody would agree that there's such a thing as bad taste, and it's completely subjective, and therefore nobody gets to rule whose taste is more appropriate than others. Brock at the end of his video was basically asking, can we agree that most, if not all, but most of the PC outrage or whatever at comedy is coming from the political left. Maybe. I think that George Carlin said it 15 years ago. That, you've got sort of the right-wing ideologues, mostly Christian fundamentalists, but not exclusively, who have their own set of sort of PC boundaries and moral outrage, and that includes comedy. What isn't off limits, and it definitely also comes from the left. I think in George Carlin's quote, he says something like these liberal college PC assholes or something like that. He said they're just as bad, but coming from a different direction. And I think that's a fair comment. I think it's the same with everything in life. My point of view is that we're all inherently got good aspects to our character and bad aspects to our character, and so, from my point of view, it shouldn't be surprising that it comes from all directions politically. It shouldn't be surprising that, things like, comedy aren't partisan, or being a law-abiding citizen or a criminal isn't a partisan issue, that kind of thing. Some things just, they are as they should be. Everyone is accepted as having flaws and different sensibilities and so on, and we should just be able to, even if you dislike something, you should be able to go, oh, whatever, dude, and leave it at that. You know what I mean? But that's easy for me to say. I come from a pretty privileged point of view where not a lot of animosity or difficulty gets thrown my way. Anyway, so there's my commentary on that issue. I wanted to address Agent of Doubt, who made a video the other day talking about price nostalgia, and also I suppose concurrently to that he was talking about wage nostalgia and how the minimum wage has sort of evolved over the years. And when I entered the workforce, it was like 1978, I think, and yeah, I was making minimum wage at my first job, which was like $2.35 an hour, but shortly after that went up to $2.65 an hour, where it stayed for a few years. After Reagan became president in 1981, minimum wage was like $3.35, and it stayed $3.35 for most of Reagan's 8 years in office. It might have even been his whole term, I can't remember. But then when it got bumped up, it went up, relatively quicker than it had. Obviously, it was stagnant for many years. The comment Mike said in his, Michael, sorry, I've never heard anyone call you Mike before, and that's, a faux pas. Anyway, but one of the things Michael said about, nowadays corporations, in particular big companies, they've just decided that, an hour's worth of labor at this unskilled job is worth this much money, and there's no room for advancement, in terms of your pay. It doesn't matter how long you stay there or how good of a job you do. If you never call in sick, if you perform outstandingly or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a raise for it. And I come from a culture, when I even when I left America in 1989 to come to the UK, it was still pretty much canon that if you were employed by the same employer for some period of time, you could expect a raise, maybe not quite once a year, but periodically, maybe once a year even. Depending on your performance and your attitude and your attendance and everything else, all these things that matter. As someone who's been an employer myself, I can fully appreciate that just having someone who shows up all the time and works hard all by itself is worth recognizing and making sure that that person doesn't want to go. And you make sure someone doesn't want to go by valuing their work and giving them pay which is above what you might pay someone else who doesn't seem to do as good of a job or doesn't seem to care as much, or you know, the value of it, your employment really ought to rise, not just because of inflation, but because of loyalty as well. I'm a big fan of the idea of unions. I think the union movement has largely been crushed thanks to policies way back in the day by Margaret Thatcher in this country and Ronald Reagan in the States. So much deregulation went on under Reagan. And in this country, they actively fought to sort of crush union power with legislation. And it worked pretty much because nowadays there's no sort of unified voice when it comes to people going on strike. You know, there are unions that represent different groups, like perhaps maybe nurses or train drivers or whatever, that kind of thing. But there's no real solidarity between unions. Like once upon a time, you know, if one union workers went on strike, other unions might go on strike as well to show their solidarity. It was all about solidarity and, you know, making the people in power recognize that you have to contend with our demands. You know, as the idea of unions gives workers a voice, gives them a say in their own prosperity, and I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be so. I don't think I think that if you have a system where you know, the ownership is never really compelled or has no incentive to give you better pay as your employment goes on. I think that that's just a culture we should be encouraging, and I think that if they don't want to do that, yeah, there should be some kind of legislation to make it the case. I mean, here in the UK, for example, you have to give 4 weeks of paid holidays. So if someone only works 2 days a week or 3 days a week, you have to give them, you know, that amount of holiday per year. So, you know, but if they work 5 days a week, then you got to give them 20 days off for holiday. And if you don't give them time off, you got to make it up to them in pay. You know, you give them a week's worth of pay for free every 3 months, that kind of thing. And as an employer myself in the UK, I only had a tiny little shop. We barely made any money at all. But I paid my employees their holiday pay, and I gave them over the minimum wage at the time. And especially every year, I bumped them up. We went out for Christmas parties and gave them Christmas bonuses and all that stuff, because I think it's important to value your employees. And I think this ethos of valuing work, unfortunately, is like a distant memory. I think people are treated now as if they're lucky to have a job, rather than the sort of culture being more that the employer's lucky to have you because you work really hard, you show up every day, and you do a good job. You know, you make them money, so we want to reward you for making us money. Not, we're going to make sure that you can earn some money doing this job that only pays this much, and you know, our profits keep going up and up and up and up, but you're only going to make this much. To me, it's just not right. Anyway, I've actually taken that in a direction I didn't mean to, but there you go, Michael. I wanted to address those thoughts because it's important to me to recognize that, you know, I think my generation, or maybe a few years younger than me, are sort of like the last who can remember when I was growing up. You know, I come from a rural area in Northern California, about an hour north of San Francisco, and when I was growing up, most of my friends in school, not even my friends, most of my acquaintances in school, in my year group anyway, most of them had a dad at work and a mom at home. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. And the idea that you could raise a family, like, you know, a whole family, and pay your bills, and, you know, and a whole family on a single income, which is what Dan was saying in his video about the milkman. You know, you raise a whole family on a single income, that is a different kind of wealth distribution than currently pertains. You know, even as recently as 1980, which is nearly 40 years ago now, granted, but it doesn't feel that long ago in the grand scheme. And in 1980, you know, in the UK, if you were like a bank manager or whatever, you're only making like 3 or 4 times what someone, you know, as a teller at the window would be making. Whereas now they make dozens of times more than the people who serve the customers. And that trend has gone on in large corporations and businesses now for the best part of 30, 40 years. And so it's not as if the economy isn't doing well in terms of, companies are making money, but the money isn't trickling down like it's supposed to, according to this whole trickle down theory. It's just plain not. Wages have been relatively stagnant for almost 3 decades now. And obviously with inflation, your wages are even worth less. I mean, I think Michael was saying to someone in the comments of his video about, or someone was saying to Michael about they used, I think, soda pop for their sort of metric of, inflation. I used to use candy bars because, when I first got old enough to buy myself candy bars with my allowance money when I was walking home from school, candy bars were 10 cents. And you're talking about a great big 6.5-inch long Three Musketeer bar or whatever would be 10 cents. And they were 10 cents until I was 12. And I started walking home from school when I was like 5. And when I was 12, candy went up to 15 cents, and it stayed there for a few years before it went up again straight from 15 to 25 cents. And candy bars taken on that sort of trend. Every time I go back to California for a visit, I'm blown away that it can cost like $1.50 to buy a candy bar. It just blows my mind. And of course, not only is the price greater, but the size of the bars shrinks as well over the years. I mean, it's pathetic when you look in this country. When I first came to this country and you get a Mars bar, it was like that. And now they're these little tiny things, It's got to be like 2/3 of its original size, for 3 times the money. So, or 6 times the money now. Anyway, so yeah, inflation sucks. And that reminds myself now, that's what I wanted to really talk about. Where the hell does inflation come from anyway? There's a whole generation of people who have basically never known a time when inflation wasn't built into the way an economy works. And as I started to say a moment ago, I'm old enough to remember when prices were relatively stable. I mean, the candy bar wasn't the only thing that had a stable price for, so many years. When I was a kid, a loaf of bread was 23 cents for fucking years. And then when it went up like to 26 cents for years. You know what I mean? And things just crept up. They didn't go up by very much. And when they went up, they would stabilize. It's not like they went up 2-3 times a year, which is what it happens with products now, especially food products in particular. That just seems to get more and more expensive to meet your basic requirements. I remember when I was first out on my own and got my first phone in my own name. So it'd be how old was I then? I think I was about 20 or 21. And yeah, my phone bill was $12 a month. 12. So, things have just gone exponentially out of control, and all the money is literally racing to the top. And, what sprinkles down can't really be called a trickle, if you ask me. It's a gratuity is what it is. Oh, here, thanks for making us rich. We'll help you stay alive with your 3 jobs. Anyway, I think inflation comes from largely, and this is something people I don't really hear this get talked about, but when I was growing up, during the time of, single income families being more common, what was also extremely uncommon was for people like regular middle class people. Certainly my parents didn't have credit cards. They had gasoline station credit cards, to get gas with. But that was the only kind of credit cards they really had. I don't think that was uncommon either. It's not like my parents were poor or anything like that. We weren't rich either, don't get me wrong, but I mean, we weren't struggling. At least that's not how I perceived it when I was growing up. We could get by and everything like that, but we didn't have my parents didn't have credit cards. My granddad, who was rich, didn't have a credit card because his philosophy was that you shouldn't spend money that you don't have. And herein lies the issue with inflation. So many people have credit cards now. I don't know if it still happens, but I remember back in the 90s, a friend of mine turned 18 and got sent a credit card in the post in America. And of course, if you just didn't want to use it, you could cut it up. And if you use it, then you've agreed to the terms and conditions by using it, and then you're automatically in debt straight away when you turn 18. And I think that's a bit insidious, but at least people were able to start with some kind of credit. Whereas in the 80s, as a young man, when I tried to get credit, I couldn't get credit because I never had credit, and I didn't really have a strong paying job or anything like that. So I didn't get a credit card for a long ass time. And at the moment, I don't use a credit card. I haven't had a credit card now for the best part of 6 or 7 years. The only time I find credit cards really convenient or make sense is if you're going to be traveling abroad. But anyway, the reason I think credit cards and small loans in particular increase inflation is simply this. You know, when you by spending money that you don't literally that you don't have, when you use a credit card, that's what you're doing. You're spending money that you don't have at the moment. You're increasing the money supply automatically. And increasing the money supply, the amount of money in circulation is where inflation comes from. When there's more money but no more earning power earning that money, that's where inflation comes from. So if we really wanted to stomp on inflation, we would have to collectively decide to seriously curtail our use of credit. And I don't see that happening. I don't think that there's the will to do that. And I certainly know the banks wouldn't want us to do that, even if we decided to sort of voluntarily go that direction. I think there'd be a lot of pushback because that's, you know, an awful lot of where their capital flow comes from. You know, so there. What do you guys think about that? I'm no economist. I admit that openly. So, you know, maybe what I've just said doesn't make any sense in the grand scheme of things, but it seems to make sense to my layman's mind. Let me know what you think down below. I look forward to our next conversation, and I'll get busy in the comment section tomorrow after I come home from the protest. I'm going to march in London in favor of a people's vote for terms of Brexit, which may be a subject for a video next week. All right, thank you for watching. Until next time, peace.